Be in the past tense. Affirmative statements, negative statements, yes no questions, and information questions.
The verb be has two past tense forms. That makes the verb be different than all other verbs in English. All other verbs in English only have one form in the past, but be has two forms. Was and were. Was is used when the subject is I or when the subject names one person or one thing, such as John was, Maria was, the dog was. With you, both singular and plural you, and with plural we and plural they, we use were. That is, if the subject is plural, use were. Or if the subject is you, we use were. As with the present tense, be functions differently than all other verbs in English. So, if you want to make was or were negative, we place the word not after was or were. Affirmative, the girls were late. Negative, the girls were not late. Affirmative, your cousin was here last night. Negative, your cousin was not here last night. In the negative, as is common with auxiliaries of various types, we frequently contract the verb was or were and not. So was not, we get wasn't. Were not, we get weren't. Here you can see examples of was and were not in their uncontracted form and in their contracted forms. To form yes-no questions with was or were, we put was or were before the subject. So, for example, we have, was Nancy sick? Were you in class last Monday? Were the girls late? Was the dog with the children? As in the present tense, we put the form of be, in this case was or were, before the subject in forming yes-no questions. It is important to put was or were before the subject in these questions because English uses word order to distinguish questions from sentences which are not questions. On this slide, you can see the contrast between the question, were the girls late? And a sentence that's not a question, the girls were late. Again, the word order of the sentence that is a question, we have was or were before the subject. The word order of the sentence that is not a question, we have the subject and then was or were. And it can be was or were in the affirmative, or it can be the negative, was not or were not. Negative does not affect the word order. The word order in questions that ask for information questions, or sometimes called WH questions. First, we have a question word, or sometimes it's more than one word. It can be a phrase. So we get a question word or phrase, then we get was or were, and then the subject, and then the rest of the sentence if there is any. The first question, when was the party? We have a question word, was, and the subject. There is no other part to the sentence. Where were you last week? In that question, we get the question word, then were, because the subject is you, and it has additional information, last week. How long was your vacation last summer? There we see we don't have just one word, we have two words, how long, then we have was, your vacation, the subject, and then last summer. The last question, who was at the party, is the exception in the sense that we don't get was followed by the subject. The reason is, in that last question, we do not have a subject. and that is why the subject position is left blank. Who was at the party? In fact, the answer to that question is what would go in that subject position. So if we have an information question where we do not have the subject, then we find that the order of the words in the question will be the same as the order of the words in the answer to the question. Who was at the party? John was at the party. So normally we have to have was or were before the subject, but in the case where we don't have a subject, the word order is different. On this slide, we can see the contrast between the word order in most information questions where we get a WH word or phrase, then was or were, and then the subject. Where were your car keys? The answer to the question, a sentence that is not a question, we get my car keys were on the kitchen counter. Again, notice that in the question, the subject comes after was or were, but in the sentence that's not a question, the subject comes before was or were. On this slide, we have another example of the question word order, information question word order, versus a sentence that is not a question. We get the question why, question word, why, then were, then the subject, the girls, and the rest of the sentence, late. In the answer to the question, we get first the girls, then were, then the word late, and then, in this case, the reason why they were late, because they live in Caguas. So here we see another example of the information question word order versus the sentence word order. On this slide, we see an example of question word order, information question word order, where the order of the question is not different than the order of the answer. This is the one exception to the normal rule where we get question word, was or were, and then the subject. And again, the reason that this is the exception to the rule is because in the question we don't have a subject, or you can argue that the question word what is in fact the subject, but because it is the question word, it comes before was or were. So we see the question, what was on the blackboard, has the same order as the answer, today's homework was on the blackboard. So keep in mind that although usually we get was or were and then the subject, in information questions where we don't have a subject, we cannot do that because we don't have the subject.